How does?
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, our group is presenting a case study on what happens when one of the world's most ambitious private companies collides with federal environmental law. The case is Center for Biological Diversity versus FAA, decided in September 2025, and it centers on SpaceX Starship rocket program in Boca Chica, Texas. Here's how we've divided the presentation. I'm Voranan, and I'm covering the introduction and case background. Steve will walk us through the facts, timeline, and key stakeholders. Kyle take on legal issues and framework. Matt covers the arguments and court decision. Jason handles the regulatory and business issues, and Alex closes it out with the ethics, proposed resolutions, and conclusion. Next slide, please. So let me set the stage. Starship is a centerpiece of SpaceX's entire future launch strategy. It was designed to carry cargo and eventually people to the moon and Mars. Boca Chica, Texas is where they're building the testing it, making this site irreplaceable to SpaceX. But Boca Chica isn't just a launch pad. It sits along a sensitive stretch of coastline, home to migratory birds, endangered sea turtles, and nearby communities who live with the noise, road closure, and risk every time a test fires. Environmental and tribal groups sued the FAA, arguing the agency hadn't properly evaluated those impacts before approving SpaceX operations. The court sided with the government, granting partial summary judgment in favor of the FAA and SpaceX. This case puts business growth, government regulation, environmental law, and public safety all in the same room. And that tension is exactly what we're here to unpack. With that, I'll hand it over to Steve to walk us through the facts, timeline, and the stakeholders at the heart of this dispute.
Thank you. Slide. So Boca Chica was initially not designed for Starship. In 2014, the FAA completed a full environmental impact statement for SpaceX Falcon rocket operations at that site. That approval cleared Falcon launches and became the baseline for everything that followed. Then, in 2019, SpaceX made a pretty significant pivot. They retooled the entire facility to develop Starship, which is a fundamentally different rocket than anything that the review was designed around. The FAA recognized that and in 2020 opened up a brand new environmental review from scratch. During that process, both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and Texas Parks and Wildlife actually recommended that the FAA do a more vigorous version of that review, a full environmental impact statement. The FAA went with the light option instead, which they called a programmatic environmental assessment, PEA. Through 2021, SpaceX drafted the assessment under FAA supervision, and it ended up with about 75 separate mitigation measures, and it goes out to the public for comment. In 2022, the FAA finalizes it, issues what's called a mitigated finding of no significant impact, and grants SpaceX the license. That license, which the 2022 decision is based off of, was being challenged in this case. That lawsuit gets filed in 2023 by environmental groups like the Cobe Nation, and in 2025, the court sided with the FAA and SpaceX. That ruling is what our whole presentation is centered around. Slide, please. The PEA looked at 13 environmental impact categories, including air quality, energy use, noise, and wildlife. But the plaintiffs narrowed their challenge down to 4. Across those 4 issues, the FAA issued the same basic structure: identify the risks, then attach a specific mitigation measure to address it. Starting with lighting, nighttime launches require pretty significant spotlighting, and that can actually disorient sea turtles, hatchlings trying to find their way to the ocean, and disrupt shorebirds on the beach. SpaceX's response was a formal lighting management plan which shielded time-controlled fixtures plus a partnership with a nonprofit group called Sea Turtle Inc. that physically goes out to the nesting season, collects eggs of sea turtles, and releases the hatchlings in a controlled way. For noise, sonic booms and engine outputs are a huge concern for both wildlife and nearby structures. The FAA modeled out the sound radius of OSHA's decibel standards and found that no inhabitable structures fell within the range where damage becomes likely. Anomalies, which are unplanned explosions during testing, was the weakest part of the FAA's whole analysis. The court literally called it, quote, imperfect. What kept finding was a formal agreement that the Texas Park and Wildlife requiring SpaceX to restore any damaged habitat with a fallback obligation to compensate if restoration didn't work. And lastly, as for access, launches and tests require shutting down the beach and surrounding areas, and the license caps at 800 hours a year, which still leaves the area accessible for about 89% of normal operating hours. Slide, please. 6 groups have a real stake in how this turns out, and split pretty clearly down into 2 camps. How fast do we move, and who bears the cost of getting it wrong? On the speed side, SpaceX needs to test rapidly and integratively, and just how the development model works, every regulatory delay is direct hit to their timeline and to their budget. The FAA is actually in a tough spot too. They're legally required under the Commercial Space Launch Act to issue a license decision within 180 days of accepting an application. Simultaneously requires them to take a genuine hard look at the environmental consequences before approving anything. Those two obligations don't always line up, and that's a big part of what makes this case super interesting. On the protection side, the environmental nonprofits, led by the Center for Biological Diversity, argued that no list of mitigation measures, no matter how long, can substitute for doing a full EIS in the first place. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and Texas Parks and Wildlife are actually a nuanced case. They both recommend a full environmental impact statement early in the process, then change their position and sign off once a mitigation plan was finalized. The Coble Crudo Nation is a co-plaintiff rating a distinct issue. They have ancestral and cultural ties to the Boca Chica beach and argue that the FAA never meaningfully consulted them before making its decisions. And the local communities around Port Isabel, South Padre Island, and Brownsville are the ones actually living with the beach closures. That tension between speed and careful review is what we're going to talk about next, so I'll hand it off to Kyle.
Thanks, Steve. So today's central question is whether the FAA violated the National Environmental Policy Act by issuing a mitigated FONSI, the finding of known significant impact, and licensing SpaceX Starship without preparing an environmental impact statement, an EIS. Under NEPA, an EIS is required when a major federal action may significantly affect the environment. A finding of no significant impact, that FONSI, is the opposite conclusion. It allows an agency to proceed without an EIS if impacts are not expected to be significant or if mitigation will reduce them below that threshold. Here, the FAA relied on a programmatic environmental assessment, what they call a PEA, prepared by SpaceX, adopted roughly 75 mitigation measures that SpaceX proposed, and concluded that impacts would be minimized. Plaintiffs argued that given Starship's scale and early concerns from agencies like the Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas Parks and Wildlife, the FAA's decision was arbitrary and capricious under the Administrative Procedure Act, meaning the agency failed to adequately consider the facts or justify its conclusion. In administrative law, arbitrary and capricious describes a decision made without a rational basis, without considering relevant data, or without explaining how the agency reached its conclusion. The court's review asked whether the FAA took NEPA's required hard look at environmental consequences, considered interagency comments, and provided a reasoned explanation supported by the record. Ultimately, the dispute is about process. Did the FAA follow NEPA's procedural safeguards and document a defensible conclusion, or did it shortcut the EIS requirement for a project with potentially significant environmental impacts? Slide, please. Here's how that legal framework fits together. NEPA is the procedural backbone. It requires agencies to analyze and publicly disclose environmental effects of major federal actions. When impacts may be significant, NEPA mandates a rigorous EIS. The core obligation is procedural. Agencies must take a documented, hard look at environmental consequences. The Administrative Procedure Act supplies the judicial review standard. Courts set aside agency actions only if they are arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion, or not in accordance with law, meaning the agency failed to examine relevant evidence, explain its reasoning, or connect facts to its conclusion. Then we have the Commercial Space Launch Act, giving the FAA authority to license commercial launches. Those licensing decisions are major federal actions, which is why they trigger NEPA review. The FAA's NEPA regulations govern how environmental assessments are prepared and accepted, when the 180-day licensing clock begins, and when a mitigated FONSI is permissible instead of an EIS. Finally, interagency consultation and mitigation shape this analysis. Biological opinions from the Fish and Wildlife Service, agreements with state agencies, and mitigation plans such as the lighting management plan that Steve mentioned, and all inform whether an EA is sufficient or whether an EIS is required. Taken together, NEPA sets the process, APS sets the review standard, the Space Launch Act provides the licensing trigger, and the interplay among these authorities determines whether the FAA's decision survives that judicial scrutiny. Now, I'll pass it on to Matt.
Thanks, Kyle. Let's start with the plaintiff side. Their argument was not that SpaceX should never launch rockets. Their concern was that the FAA approved a major expansion of Starship activity without the deeper review NEPA may require when a federal action could significantly affect the environment. They argued that the FAA should have prepared a full environmental impact statement instead of relying on the shorter PEA. Boca Chica is not empty land. It includes wildlife habitat, endangered species, public beach access, and land with cultural and religious meaning for the Comecrudo Nation. The plaintiffs highlighted four main risks: lighting, noise, launch anomalies, and access closures. They argued that SpaceX's efforts to reduce these risks were not enough. Lighting and noise might disturb wildlife. Explosions could spread debris, and closures could restrict public and tribal access. Next slide, please. Now from the FAA and SpaceX's point of view, they saw this issue a little differently. They said NEPA does not demand a perfect environmental result or the safest possible choice. Instead, it requires the agency to study the impacts, review the evidence, and make an informed decision. The FAA looked at 13 different impact categories, gathered public comments, worked with Fish and Wildlife and Texas Park and Wildlife, and added about 75 mitigation measures to the final approval. These measures included lighting controls, wildlife monitoring, limits on beach closures, and promises to restore affected areas. They argued that a full EIS was not needed because the mitigation steps reduced the impacts enough to justify a finding of no significant impact. The legal standard also worked in their favor. The court was not deciding if it would have made the same choice, but whether the FAA acted in an unreasonable and unpredictable way. So the FAA and SpaceX said the court should trust the agency's technical judgment. Next slide, please. Here's how the case turned out. The court mostly agreed with FAA and SpaceX. Judge Carl Nichols decided that the PEA met legal requirements and the FAA did not act unreasonably by choosing not to prepare a full EIS. The main point is that NEPA is mostly about procedure. It does not require FAA to stop launches or pick the most environmentally friendly option. It only requires the agency to study environmental effects, consider ways to reduce harm, and explain its decision. The court found that the FAA gave proper attention to lighting, noise, launch problems, and access closures. It did admit that the analysis of launch anomalies, especially explosions, was not perfect. However, the court still decided the FAA managed the risk through debris planning, restoration promises, and its agreement with Texas Park and Wildlife. The important idea here is deference. The court did not make the decision again itself. It only checked if the FAA's decision was reasonable. Since the FAA documented its review and linked approval to mitigation steps, the decision was upheld. Now over to Jason to discuss regulatory and business issues.
Thanks, Matt. So going into regulatory issues, one of the biggest regulatory challenges is that the FAA has two competing responsibilities. On one hand, Congress wants commercial space industry to grow quickly because it supports economic development, national security, and NASA programs such as Artemis. On the other hand, the FAA must ensure that launches comply with environmental laws and protect nearby communities. This creates an inherent tension because rapid innovation moves faster than traditional regulatory processes. The Boca Chica case demonstrates that regulatory agencies are increasingly being asked to evaluate technologies that evolve much faster than the existing environmental review frameworks. Although the FAA ultimately concluded that the environmental impacts could be mitigated and approved, the program would require mitigation measures. The case demonstrates the ongoing tension between accelerating technological innovation, and maintaining public accountability. Now, going into the business strategy, What makes this interesting from a business perspective is that regulation directly affects SpaceX's business model. Unlike traditional aerospace companies that rely on long development cycles, SpaceX follows an iterative approach of building, testing, learning, and improving. Every launch delay pushes engineering schedules back, increases labor cost, and can affect major customers such as NASA and commercial satellite operators. However, the case also shows that regulatory compliance can become competitive advantage. Companies that build strong relationships with regulators, communicate openly with local communities, and invest in environmental mitigations are more likely to receive approval efficiency and avoid costly litigation. Instead of viewing compliance as a barrier to innovation, organizations should integrate it into their overall business strategy. By working proactively with regulators, local communities, and environmental stakeholders, SpaceX can reduce long-term risk, avoid costly delays, and maintain its competitive advantage while continuing to innovate. And now I'll pass it on to Alex, who's going to go over ethics and proposed regulations.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. So the ethical issue is not whether SpaceX should be allowed to innovate. The issue is who carries the risk when that innovation affects people, wildlife, and public land. SpaceX gains launch data, contracts, jobs, and national space leadership, but the local community and environment may carry the cost through the noise, closures, debris, fire risk, and wildlife disruption. This makes the FAA's rule very critical. The FAA is not just approving a business project, it is deciding whether the public risks are transparent, minimized, and fairly managed. Next slide, please. So my proposed resolution is to not shut down SpaceX or allow unlimited testing. A better solution is conditional approval. SpaceX should be allowed to continue testing because commercial space development has major business and national value. However, the FAA should require clear, enforceable mitigation measures, transparent reporting after launches, and updated review when a launch causes major environmental effects. If explosions, debris fields, fires, or public closures is increased beyond what was studied, the FAA should reassess before allowing expansion. This keeps the benefit of agency expertise while recognizing that after Looper Bright, courts have a strong role in reviewing whether agencies acted within legal authority. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, Center for Biological Diversity versus FAA shows how modern business law works when innovation, regulation, and ethics collide. SpaceX is pushing one of the most important rocket programs in the world, but the FAA's approval process must also protect the public, wildlife, and surrounding communities. The most important takeaway is that legal approval alone does not settle the ethical issue. Commercial space companies need public trust. The best path forward is not to stop innovation, but to make sure innovation is paired with transparency, accountability, and real safeguards. And that is it. Thank you very much.